webinars on radicalism, extremism, and Islamophobia from offline to online. I'm Leuven, a professor of communication science at the Institute for Media Studies at KU Leuven, Belgium, and I'll be your host of this webinar today, and very glad to welcome 7 speakers who will talk to us, give us 4 presentations in the next hour and a half. As our time is limited and as our audience is quite big today, we will take questions from the chat box and also from the Padlet that was prepared for the master students following this webinar. So please share your questions with us so that we can deal with a selection of them at the end of this session. After each presentation, I will ask a short question to the presenters, allowing the next speaker to get ready for his presentation. Both webinars present research on extremist ideologies, specifically tackling 2 narratives: Islamist extremism, radicalism, and Islamophobia. These webinars are part of the activities of a project funded by the European Commission entitled Extremely E-United, aimed at preventing the spread of radicalization among youth in European countries. This initiative focuses on the need to secure the future of younger generations who run the risk of being lured by extremist propaganda. Due to the prominent rhetoric displayed by radical groups in the online world, Extremely United assigns an important role to the actions online by supplying videos, podcasts, and other tools to empower the voices of young people who promote values of mutual respect and empathy. In the last decades, we have witnessed an increase in hate discourses, sentiments, and practices originating from and directed at Muslims, categorized as Islamic extremism and Islamophobia. The recent events and evidences demonstrate that these 2 extreme ideologies expand across local contexts to become a global phenomenon. Radicalization is a dynamic, complex process that is fueled by intergroup tensions as a result of political, social, and economic conflicts. It involves a shift from a moderate point of view to an extreme and uncompromising view that demands drastic societal change to benefit specific groups, although not necessarily accompanied by violence. Over the last years, populist parties and actors have also mobilized an important number of people through campaigns and have radicalized mainstream politics. Along with these populist waves, the jihadi Islamist movements added to that polarization of social and political debates by engaging in violent actions. So these 2 discourses feed one another and create a vicious cycle that increases public hostility, sustaining an ambience of fear, radicalizing supporters in committing violence. Today's webinar presents research from Canada, Poland, and Belgium. It looks at media content as well as at opinions and attitudes of audiences, specifically young people. Let me introduce our first speaker. Abdelwahed Mekki Berada is a professor in anthropology of mental health and anthropology of Islam at Laval University in Quebec City, Quebec, Canada. He will present a transnational project he currently leads on the consequences of Islamophobia, scholarly Islamophobia in the media, studying the discourse and the impact. He has played a key role in the aftermath of the Quebec mosque attack in January 2017 in mobilizing community support and promoting mutual understanding. And according to good Canadian practice, the first and second presentation will be bilingual in French and in English. So Abdelwahed, the virtual floor is all yours.
So can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn, Professor Denens, for inviting me to talk about this 4 years research action project that started only a few months ago, and which is funded by, sorry, I have a PowerPoint.
Yes. You can share it if you wish.
Here we go. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. So as you see, the title is Scholarly and Media Islamophobia, a transnational study of discourses and their impact. I am actually invited to talk in less than 10 minutes about the research protocol as such, and not about results, as actually the ethnographic work is currently on hold because of the pandemic. Nevertheless, I am very pleased that my colleagues from Concordia, University of Concordia, will in the next few minutes present some results about media Islamophobia in the province of Quebec, Canada, and I thank them for that. It is a transnational project in that it suggests to study Islamophobia in 8 cities and 4 countries with partners from 16 universities, research centers, and local NGOs, as shown in the slide, and I'm honored to work with all of them. The questions addressed in this transnational research action project revolve around 3 complementary axes. The first axis consists in better understanding what I have called scholarly Islamophobia, or Islamophobie savante, or Islamophobie pseudo-savante, as declined in publications by social scientists from 2010 on. A second axis, which is media Islamophobia, consists in media analysis to better understand the role played by scholarly Islamophobia in traditional daily newspapers posted online, and also in a time span starting from 2010 until the end of the project in around 2024. And finally, a third axis, which I have called, for good or worse, experiential Islamophobia, consists of conducting ethnographic work to examine how scholarly and media Islamophobia are received and perceived by Muslim citizens, and how they impact on their daily life. In this third axis, we are most particularly interested in identifying and understanding 3 things. First, the emotional, social, and professional consequences of Islamophobia on the life of people who define themselves as Muslims. Second, we are interested in the strategies that the Muslim respondents implement to deal with adversities secondary to Islamophobia. A third point we like to address is the collective mobilization strategies and solidarities against Islamophobia by both Muslims and non-Muslims, and this dimension of Muslims, non-Muslims solidarity is central to this action project. Now, what in 5 minutes can I say about what we mean by Islamophobia in this project? Social sciences often perceive Islamophobia as a moral panic, which tends to be aroused in the West by the figure of the Muslim as an existential threat. There are social scientists and essayists whose work, writes the anthropologist Gilles Bibot, form, I try to translate, the direct symptom of the existence in academic circles of scholarly Islamophobia, which distills hostile discourses under the guise of science, And we wish to tackle these guys, so to speak. We aim at examining whether or not this scholarly Islamophobia is maintained by some social scientists, and to what extent they are deeply imbued with an outdated Orientalism of the 18th and 19th centuries and relate today in many media. At least this is an hypothesis we will see to document. Another hypothesis is that media Islamophobia will in turn surf on the kind of legitimization brought by scholarly Islamophobia, as well as on our days collective anxiety to promote Islamophobia, including gender Islamophobia among the general population. We here consider Islamophobia as a discursive strategy made of hate speech, exclusion, violence, and discrimination, and where Islam tends to be constructed as a lasting trauma, as put it Edouard Said, un traumatisme durable, and where Muslims are targeted solely because of their Islamicness. Islamophobia is the expression of a form of social domination accompanied by an attempt at ontological inferiorization, dehumanization, and an animalization of the Muslim other, as you may have seen in the previous slide. Islamophobia is first and foremost about power. Islamophobia is also, in the Foucauldian meaning of the term, a form of governmentality of Muslim otherness, kind of biopolitic of controlling Muslim populations, mostly in the context of immigration, which a form of governmentality which, far from being limited to the expression of far-right violent radicalization, tends today to be normalized, institutionalized, and globalized. It's becoming a kind of ordinary violence, which translates into everyday life, kind of banalisation de l'islamophobie. Finally, Islamophobia is here seen, I think this is quite interesting for us to explore. Islamophobia is here seen as a form of violent radicalization in itself. And to better understand Islamophobia as a violent radicalization or a radicalization leading to violence, it is essential, I think, to attempt a better understanding of Islam in itself. In other words, it would be very hard to understand the complexity of Islamophobia without understanding the complexity of Islam in itself. And this is a challenge we may face in this project. Beyond its religious foundations, Islam is indeed considered in this collective work as being all at once a system of representations as suggested by the interpretive anthropology of Clifford Geertz, a discursive and embodied tradition as suggested by the anthropologist Talal Assad, and a technology of the self in Technologie de Soi, as suggested by the philosopher Michel Foucault. It is this epistemological trident, ce trièdre épistémologique, in its entirety, these three dimensions that make this epistemological trident in its entirety, which constitutes the elementary structure of Islam, beyond its religious foundation. And it is indeed such a simplistic view to reduce Islam to the radically violent behavior of a minority of people who identify themselves as Muslim and who are unfortunately quite known in the last few days, weeks, months, and years. Okay, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to develop here this epistemological thread, and please see if you are interested, for those who are interested, my 2018 and 2019 publications that you can see on this slide. As a concluding statement, I would add in this brief overview, I would add that Islam cannot be summed up in this brief epistemological sketch, but it indicates Islam's dizzying complexity, at least for the way anthropologists try to see Islam. The apprehension of this complexity is necessary, even if difficult and challenging detour, for a better understanding. That is, an understanding reluctant to the simplistic and reductive explanations which tend to characterize Islamophobia today. Some examples of such a simplistic view are when Islamophobic discursivity sees self-criticism within Islam as an oxymoron, a paradox that is impossible to solve. Muslims cannot criticize themselves, which is a simplistic view, I guess. Or when it sees Muslim women as essentially victims of their false consciousness, leur fausse conscience. Or also when it considers when this Islamophobic discursivity considers Muslims as essentially unable to be nonviolent. Finally, I will end it here. Islamophobia is both a complex concept and a complex sociopolitical reality, which calls to humility from researchers. It's indeed a complex question. Therefore, such an important issue requires a complex and most of all a nuanced answer that we will hopefully contribute to provide through our transnational research action project, very briefly outlined here. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mekki Berada. So while the next team is already preparing the slides for sharing, maybe I could ask you a question, because of course we're interested in the role of the media. And I remember having discussed with you the role of the so-called confrontation radio stations in Quebec, the quote-unquote garbage radios that make particularly violent statements and that are active in Quebec City. Could you talk a little bit about this, because we're less familiar with this phenomenon here in Europe still, in this part of Europe still?
Well, I guess my colleague Vivek, who is a specialist in this issue, could say a few things. But it's indeed an interesting social phenomenon that is kind of specific to Quebec City. Montreal, the most important, I guess, city in the province of Quebec, is very reluctant to être l'autre, to have such radios with kind of that entertain Islamophobia and other. Actually, they're not only against Islam; they are against women, against Islam, against immigrants. It's kind of what I called, please excusez-moi l'expression, what in the US they call white angry males. You know, it's kind of radios led by white angry males, and it's not, ce n'est pas un hasard que c'est à Québec, à la ville de Québec, où il y a ces radios, que the first mass killing in a mosque happened in the West. I mean, c'est à Québec que la première tuerie dans une mosquée dans l'histoire de l'humanité a eu lieu en Occident. The second one was Christchurch. So there is a kind of une sorte de bulle à l'intérieur de la ville de Québec qui rend possible ce genre de dérive. This is said, they use the freedom of speech, but I don't want to elaborate on that. So now they surf on this very thin line between freedom of speech and hate, un appel à la haine, which is actually qui est sanctionné par la loi canadienne, par la loi canadienne, mais il joue sur cette ligne très mince qui sépare la liberté d'expression et l'appel à la haine, ce qui leur vaut beaucoup de poursuites en justice, mais c'est leur gagne-pain, c'est jouer sur cette ligne mince.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and yeah, it's a phenomenon to monitor, absolutely. We now move on to Professor Vivek Venkatesh and his team, who will present their ongoing research as part of the cross-country research project that was just presented by Professor Niki Berada. And Vivek Venkatesh is a professor of inclusive practices in visual arts in the Department of Art Education at Concordia University in Montreal. He's working at the intersection of public pedagogy and critical digital literacy. He's the UNESCO co-chair in the profession of radicalization and violent extremism. He's going to co-present with Jihen Hishri, who is preparing her PhD in education at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and a researcher of the project Someone. Her research revolves around the perception of the other, social exclusion, hate speech, and the prevention of violent radicalization. And Rauda Harp will also co-present. She's a researcher at that same project, Someone, and working also for the UNESCO co-chair for the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism. She's a teacher in adult education and preparing her PhD at Concordia University. Her passion lies in advocating for at-risk youth and communities, online and offline. Please go ahead with the presentation.
Merci beaucoup, Lynn, and thanks everyone for being here. Really wonderful to see the social capital that that Extremely United has in bringing together such a diverse array of researchers and practitioners for today's webinar. I'm really pleased to present this with you. So I won't stick with the introductions, just to say that at the end of our presentation, you'll see a few websites and our social media feeds where you can follow some more of our work. But today, what Jihen, Rauda, myself, on behalf of Abdelwahed also want to present is, as Abdelwahed pointed out, some analyses of texts that have been published in Quebec daily media. So I'll plow right on with this. What we're going to talk to you about today is grounded in a methodology called corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis. And this is a technique that was developed by one of my former PhD students, Tija Thomas, as part of her dissertation back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And she was looking specifically at the issue of veils that were being banned, or at least were proposed to be banned in Quebec at that time. So this is preceding the awful terrorist attack in the Quebec mosque that Abdelwahed was speaking about. And it also precedes some of the other terrorist attacks that have been carried out on Canadian soil, which have been sort of bringing together the constructs of Islamophobia, Islamist extremism, but also the rise of populist and right-wing extremism. What corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis does is that it takes two techniques. One is grounded in quantitative statistics and large-scale quantitative statistics, which has been developed by applied linguists. And it combines this with the qualitative technique of critical discourse analysis. So essentially, what happens is that we take corpus of texts and we find to what extent the co-location of words, and in other terms, what that means is how words are related to one another in terms of distance with each other. So if the word Islam and terrorism appear close to one another, How often do those frequencies occur? And to what extent can we then extract some themes based on qualitative analysis and figure out what kinds of discourses are being conducted with regards to this? So while the concept is quite straightforward, the analysis itself can be quite involved. And both Jihen and Rauda have, if I'm not mistaken, several projects worth and years of experience in conducting these. We have been working with CACTA, or corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis, in a number of domains. Tija developed it, as you can see on the top left-hand corner, and since then I worked with one of my other PhD students, Lee Meller, where we looked specifically at how discussions around judicial practices as it pertains to child crimes were conducted for the Slender Man killings. We've also published some studies around how online hate speech is promoted in cultural scenes. But I think most importantly, and both Rauda and Jihen were involved in this, we conducted a series of CACTA analyses on incidents of Islamophobia, misogyny, violent extremism, religion, that were being conducted on Reddit, YouTube, and Facebook threads by both Lebanese and Canadian citizens. And all of this is available on our website, which is called wordsincontext.ca. We'll show you the link later. So these are just 4 examples of ways in which we have published in the academic sphere. And regardless of the academic value of the work, I think it's important for me to specify that our work in Project Someone and the UNESCO Chair really reaches out to the broader public and wants to engage them in these discussions. So before I hand off the mantle to Jihen, here are the broader objectives of what we were trying to do. And these were developed in consultation with Abdel Wahid, who's leading this project, the broad project with us, and asked us to work on this issue around Islamophobia in Quebec daily media. So we wanted to understand the themes that were being that could be defined as Islamophobic from texts that are relayed by columnists and editorial writers in these Quebec dailies. But also we wanted to see how the discursive strategies around these themes of Islamophobia were being developed or disseminated and even received by readers of these newspapers. So in order to do that, we analyzed texts from, I believe, 10 years worth of Quebec dailies. I'm going to pass the mantle off to Jihen. Jihen, tu me diras quand tu veux que je passe la prochaine diapo, mais vas-y, merci beaucoup.
Bonjour à tout le monde, merci Vivek. Donc, afin de repérer un maximum de ressources numériques, nous avons fait une recherche à l'aide de mots-clés. Nous avons cherché islam, musulman, islamique, islamiste, islamophobie, islamophobe. Donc, vous pouvez passer deuxième slide, Vivek, s'il vous plaît. Donc, nous avons affiné la recherche en sélectionnant les éditoriaux, les chroniques des 8 quotidiens les plus lus au Québec, comme le Journal de Montréal, le Journal de Québec, la Presse, Le Soleil, Montréal Gazette, Globe and Mail, L'Actualité et Le Devoir. Nous avons obtenu plus de 1500 articles, ce qui nous a permis de créer un très grand corpus à l'aide de logiciel Sketch Engine qui contient plus de 3 millions de mots, majoritairement en français, mais on a quand même un très grand corpus en anglais. Donc, vous pouvez voir ici la fréquence des mots clés comme l'islam, l'islamisme, islamiste. C'est très fréquent dans notre corpus. On peut passer au troisième. Afin d'effectuer une analyse de colocation, des analyses des mots-clés. Donc, Sketch Engine nous a permis d'identifier les mots qui sont très associés ensemble, comme le mot islam. Il a été associé à plusieurs termes comme critiqué, radical, politique, islamiste. Si on prend par exemple le mot islam avec le mot radical, ces 2 termes ont été associés par Sketch Engine. Ils apparaissent ensemble dans le corpus d'une manière récurrente, donc 17 fois dans le corpus avec un log dice. Ça veut dire, le log dice, c'est le score de leur relation ensemble. Donc c'est 11.19, c'est statistiquement significatif. Ma collègue Rauda va par la suite vous expliquer davantage comment ça se fait ce calcul. Si on passe au slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Donc, après avoir effectué une analyse quantitative, nous avons pu regrouper les termes qui ont été associés en thématiques, ce qui nous a permis de faire une analyse critique des discours. Ce qui ressort du corpus français, c'est que le terme islamophobie il est souvent associé au terme racisme, liberté d'expression. Souvent, les chroniqueurs ou les éditorialistes vont refuser d'attribuer ou de qualifier leurs propos comme des propos islamophobes ou des propos racistes. Ils vont souvent dire que critiquer l'islam et les musulmans, c'est une liberté d'expression. Alors que d'autres chroniqueurs éditorialistes vont faire la différence ou la distinction entre islamophobie et liberté d'expression. Ils vont dire que le racisme et l'islamophobie, ça existe, c'est une réalité sociale. Donc, ils vont appuyer leurs propos par des textes savants, ils vont faire appel à des textes de sociologues, des experts, pour dire par exemple que l'islam ou les valeurs musulmanes sont incompatibles avec les valeurs occidentales. Donc, ils vont aussi présenter les musulmans à travers des événements révélateurs d'un islam intégraliste. Ce qui ressort aussi dans les résultats, c'est qu'on note une peur de l'islam liée à des enjeux identitaires. Par exemple, on parle beaucoup des valeurs québécoises, des enjeux sécuritaires, on parle de dangers des islamistes, du terrorisme et des enjeux économiques. On parle aussi de l'immigration des musulmans qui font augmenter la charge sociale du gouvernement ou de la société québécoise. Aussi, on note un point très intéressant, que les lecteurs, on a analysé les commentaires des lecteurs qui, eux aussi, reprennent le discours médiatique et ils vont s'appuyer aussi sur des textes savants. Je passe la parole à ma collègue Rhoda qui va vous expliquer ce qui sort.
Hello, merci Jihan. So yeah, just to, so Jihan had kindly showed us how some of the words co-located together. So first of all, I just wanted to show you very quickly the formula in case you're interested. So when a word shows up in a corpus, which is what we create, so we basically picked over 1,000 articles, we put them together, we fed them into Sketch Engine, but the number of times, so this is our focus corpus, this is what's going to be called the focus corpus here, and because it's a corpus that we created, so it, you know, by all intents and purposes, people might be like, you know, you're choosing your articles, and that is correct. But when the calculations are made, so when Sketch Engine tells us that these two words co-locate at 11.19, for example, which is Islam and radical, which Jihan just showed us, it is because, so the calculation is done, so the frequency of these words are always calculated with reference to the frequency of those words that show up in a reference corpus, which is compiled, collected, and stored in Sketch Engine, and is completely unbiased, and there's nothing that we could do to affect it. So, and that is the reference corpus, and the calculation is always made with reference to that reference corpus. And the calculations are always done in logarithms because of the massive amount of words in these corpora. And so always the magical number we're looking for is 10. So whenever two words co-locate at a score of 10 and more, that means they are significantly showing up together, or in a text. So they are written several times together, and in reference to a different corpus or article. Next one, please. So I also wanted to show you just a quick look on how it shows up. So see how like in the red, you could see Mo and Islamophobia. It's how they co-locate together. I mean, they're kind of useless for all intents and purposes in this case, but they, excuse me, so these words showed up that many times, and then we can click to see the context that they come in, so that we can, as Vivek had said, extract themes that we then analyze qualitatively. So first we look at the quantitative values, we say that they come together, we try to see how many times and what they look like, we copy the text, and then we examine it qualitatively. And this is really done specifically to remove any of our personal biases or knowledges or anything in like all of our research. We really try to examine each text in this manner. Yeah. Next one, please. So for the English, so I did mostly so what we had done was we, as some of you might know, there's a constant, long, historic, anxious relationship between the province of Quebec and the rest of Canada. Mainly it's a language issue, it's a cultural issue. I'm not going to get into that, but yeah, so there is that presence constantly. So we had decided when Jihan and I, and we consulted with Vivek and Abdel Wahid, we had decided to separate the texts that came from Montreal and Quebec City, because they are two different metropoles, and we just wanted to see how the people, because the culture really does feed into a lot of these texts, but also separate the English from the French. So I looked at English Montreal and then also French in Quebec. So they were completely separate. Very interestingly, the results in Quebec City, the Francophone articles, were very similar to the Francophone articles we found in Montreal. The readers' reactions, the writers' reactions, the same summary that Jihan gave, that was accurate. For the English, there was a little bit of a segue. So summarized in 5 points. When the word veil was alone in the text, it's often co-located with positive words. They were defending women who wear the veil. They were defending the right to choose, that these are women who chose to wear this. They're educated, they're not, they're this, they're that, it doesn't matter. But as soon as the word veil co-located with face, so the burqa, the wear of the burqa, there was a huge uproar against it. There was an ask to ban it, that it was not particularly a religious choice, it was more of a cultural choice. These women were probably mistreated and forced to wear it, even though there were texts to the opposite, but that was the thing. Islam and terror were co-located very often. So even when there were other terrorist attacks against Muslims in Canada, in Quebec, in New Zealand, so there was mention of Christchurch, there was mention in Quebec, none of those were referred to as terrorist attacks. But anything that was committed by a person who identified as a Muslim were identified as terrorist attacks. But then there was the discussion, so at least there was a discussion whether that is fair or not. Islamophobia was interesting. It was the same result as the French. So people were like, no, we're not, Islamophobia doesn't exist. We just really need to be able to attack Islam or Prophet Muhammad like we do Christ and Christianity. We just need that liberty. That came. Far right and terror, very interestingly, did not co-locate. So far right was defended as a movement that is happening, not necessarily a terrorist movement and not necessarily committing any terror. And then the last one was the English versus French readers. So often we found that the French readers listened to their experts, and they used the experts' arguments in their own arguments, whereas the English were often sometimes going against them. So sometimes they would call a Globe and Mail Globe and Muslim because they thought that some of the articles were, pro-Muslim or, Also, there was a couple of historians mentioned or Canadian professors, like Professor Hewitt, for example, they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so says that Islamophobia is existing because of all of the influx of Muslims, because of immigration and just an increased number of a particular population. And so that's an increased number of incidents committed by them. But also we're denying them. We're not really integrating them. We're not really welcoming them. We're bringing them here and we're not. And the readers were like, okay, so let's just not bring them in then, because that's why that's why Islamophobia exists, is because we're accepting all of these Muslims in. So it was a very interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thank you a lot. Yes, there's a lot to be asked, and it's only the beginning, I imagine, of this vast corpus that you're trying to dig into and make meaning out of it. I was interested in getting to know a bit more about these reactions of the readers, because that's a really interesting part of your research. The English language readers and the Francophone readers. Were like the Francophone readers more referring to French from France sources, and also maybe relating more to what they knew and heard in their Francophone media on what happened in Europe, for instance, the attacks in Paris and Brussels, or am I just making a reference that wasn't found in your corpus.
Well, I can let Jihan speak to that in more detail if she wants to, but I think that there is a certain sense of Eurocentrism that that grounds a part of these discussions, when in fact the problems that are being faced in North America are tied to North American conditions. I think if anything, people are asking about what kinds of cultures are being imported into North America, how those cultures in fact impact the way in which we view the difference between inter and multiculturalism. Quebec really focuses on and has a policy around interculturalism, which is very different from multiculturalism and involves ensuring that people are integrated, sometimes forcibly, as we're seeing now with a new law that does not allow teachers and public servants to wear any sort of religious garb while they're performing their work. So, no, I think that we need to move away from the Eurocentrism of this problem. Obviously, when terrorism attacks happen in Europe, there is coverage here and people speak about those issues, but it's mostly for political gain and less around public perceptions. The issues that plague North America are distinctly North American, and yes, they're imported from places that people come to.
Yes, okay, thanks a lot. Let's now move to Europe, actually, from North America to Europe and to Poland more specifically, and move from a media content perspective to a perspective of the audience, and especially then young audiences. And Katarzyna Gorak-Sosnowska and Joanna Sozanska will talk about their joint research on the building blocks of Polish Islamophobia and the case of Polish youth. Katarzyna Gorak-Sosnowska earned her PhD in economics at the Warsaw School of Economics and her habilitation in the study of religions at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She's an associate professor at the Middle East and Central Asia Unit and vice dean of the master's program at the Warsaw School of Economics. Her research focuses on contemporary Middle East and Muslim minorities in Europe. Joanna Sozanska is a PhD candidate at Warsaw School of Economics and leader of the Young Scientists Corporation at the Institute for Security and International Development. She graduated from Jagiellonian University from the Faculty of Middle Eastern Studies and International Relations, and she received Erasmus Mundus scholarships in Morocco and Turkey. She's a laureate of the Top Minds program of the Polish-US Fulbright Commission. The floor is yours.
Okay, I am not muted anymore. So thank you very much for having us here. And we are always happy to have also the Central Eastern European perspective, even though it's not homogeneous, because we are in a way a strange region, I must say. We have hardly any Muslim population. In case of Poland, it's 0.1% of the total population, yet the narratives are very strongly built around Islamophobia, around intolerance against Muslims, especially in politics, and especially in what you can see at the moment, starting in 2015, the rise of the conservative nationalist party, which is now leading our country. So this is what makes us, I would say, unique in a way, because we are afraid of someone who is not even there, and it pays off in politics. And what makes us unique even more is that our young people, especially, unlike the older population, are more Islamophobic. So while usually the younger you are, the more tolerant, open-minded, and so on, in the case of Poland, it's different. So what we were trying to see is why young Poles are often more Islamophobic than the rest of the society. What makes them more Islamophobic? Because this is, you know, this is strange, we would say. So we were trying to figure out what triggers Islamophobic discourse. It's definitely not like, you know, based, well, it bases on available opinion polls, it bases on some of our own research, and these are just the building blocks. So what could make the link? And we have the three links identified here. One is related to education, the other is related to the idea how Polishness is being constructed, and the third one is the social media, since the workshop is about internet and social media, so that also plays the role.
Yeah, so now I would like to talk briefly about the current picture of the Polish young people. The current picture is not even more complicated and complex. Polish young people, by which we mean generation Y and Z, is still apolitical, but at the same time more committed to the right wing. The proportion of those who declare absolutely no interest in politics is a constant. And at the same time, many young Poles turn to the right wing, which often goes beyond the traditional right of the political stem. Right-wing conservative views are currently the most expressed political focus among the politically declared Polish young people. And the right wing and the populist parties started to consolidate young Poles during the campaign to the European Parliament in 2014, and also to our Polish Parliament in 2015, what is very, very important because they base on the anti-European Union rhetoric, anti-refugees rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And what is very, very important, and I would like to underline it, right wings and populist parties are supported by the radical groups and organizations like the football hooligans groups and Independence March Association. And we would like to present two posters referring to the Independence March Association. We would like to show this year's poster, and you think the Independence March in Poland will take place in 1 week. So on the right side, there is like the original poster where the Hazar soldier is like aiming, pointing his sword to the star with the LGBT flag and the red flag. And on the top it says, "Our civilization, our rules." And on the left side is the parody of this poster, like showing a sword as a spike for the kebab. Why kebab? Maybe perhaps because the kebab is the very, very popular fast food among radical groups. But we would like to show like the parody and like the another sides of the persuasion to Independence March Association.
Okay, even though we call it parody, we are really sad that this is the official poster of an independence march. Yeah, to be against someone, this is how we identify our idea of being Polish. It's terrible. But anyway, what are the building blocks? We have the three of them, and now I mean you can see that it's not easy to make the Polish youth in a way different. First of all, you have teaching about different cultures. So, well, starting with the fact that everybody or almost everybody in Poland looks like us. We are Slavic, ethnically Polish, speak Polish language, most probably Catholic, and so on and so on. It's hard to teach about other cultures, and it's easy to go into, in a way, essentialized version. So what we teach, if we teach at all, is essentialized image, like the Orientalist, pure Orientalist image of the other cultures. Then you have history. Our history focuses on us. And as you know, Polish history is about being victims or about being heroes. In both cases, we are better than the others, either because we are suffering or because, we fought against someone. Quite often in geography, you have this essentialized terms, like one of the topics is the causes of world terrorism, Islam against the West. So in one sentence, you already have the explanation, and this is how you should teach. When it comes to religion, we have a lot of religious instruction in Poland, but it's about Catholic religion only. So we are basically religiously ignorant. I mean, like very ignorant. Then you have the second building blocks. What you have just seen, and we decided to present to you the posters because they were just, published 2 days ago, is consuming nationalism, but nationalism understood in a closed matter. Nationalism not like open, welcome to Poland, feel free to be here on your own, enjoy, but in a way in this closed ethnic religious manner. What we also have in there is that Islamophobic narrative is quite often linked to the way EU identity is constructed. You know that we have not been able to catch up economically with the Western world or the Western part of Europe. We are still in a way behind. It bothers us a bit. So if you ask, or if you take a look at the Eurobarometer, you will see that Polish people enjoy the economic freedom, economic flow of goods and other stuff, but they are not really into the rule of law, the solidarity. This is not really interesting. What is more, the Islamophobic discourse is quite often used against the Western Europe as an ultimate proof that you over there have not managed the refugee crisis efficiently, and it's us who are better because we have not accepted the refugees and we are better off. And it's also sad, but this is the second building block.
And the third factor is sharing Islamophobia through the social media. And what is very, very important, internet is the most popular source for the young pools, and also source of the hate speech for the young people. And it is very, very sad and important that is like the very important source during the age of disinformation. And the Muslims are one of the most popular targets of online hate speech. Of course, also with the LGBT community, also with the refugees community, and also today's women's movement. What is very, very sad, the political acceptance for the hate speech towards the particular social groups. Like the women's movement, LGBTs, and the Muslim groups. So for sure, like the mix of these factors has a huge influence to the higher levels of Islamophobia among young pools.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your attention. And well, let's hope that one day it will be better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this Polish reality, sharing it with us and talking about these building blocks, about the social media. Well, you're also teachers, trainers yourself. Do you think that media literacy and some criticalness about sources, like the softer skills, let's say, digital skills, is that a key to perhaps a way out of this danger or this risk or risky trajectory towards radicalization in Poland?
For sure. And if you take a look again at digital skills in Europe, we are again behind, lagging behind, except for maybe Estonia, I think Czech Republic and Lithuania. Our region lags behind. And also the second building block again, if you take a look at the way we are teaching, we are basically about solving tests, learning by heart, definitions, information, repeating the same thing. We don't have many classes that actually teach this critical thinking. And this is again, something that we are missing. And I hope that maybe one day, it could make a difference, because, if you have a seminar, and we also have seminars like how to understand fake news. I will not go there, because I know that I am, an expert. Nobody has to teach me what a fake news is. But then on the other hand, this is what you actually replicate online. And this is, again, sad thing, how we are complaining too much, I guess. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll have some maybe some questions in the Q&A session. So please, the audience, feel free to add the Padlet and also add some questions to our Q&A chat box. The fourth and the last presenter of today's webinar is Thomas Frissen. His research on the internet, The Great Radicalizer, takes us back to Belgium. Thomas holds a PhD in social sciences from KU Leuven and is an assistant professor in digital technology and society at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. His research focuses on the radicalization of and by the online information ecosystem. Previously, he studied relationships between digital media and Salafi jihadism, right-wing extremism, and communities of non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. Currently, he's working on a project that aims to understand and predict how different forms of disinformation spread online. Tom, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Lane, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you also for having me. So I assume you see the screen, my start screen, and you hear me. Okay, so that's good. So yeah, well, hello everyone. Bon matin, Quebec. Good afternoon, Europe. I'm Thomas. I'm currently working as an assistant professor in digital technology and society in Maastricht in the Netherlands. And my talk today is entitled Internet, the Great Radicalizer. And it will be a brief peek into the relationships between seeking for online extremist content and cognitive radicalization in young adults, specifically in Belgian youth. So let me see how I get this working. There we go. So it's a summary of a recent article that is published in Computers and Human Behavior, and which was one of the components of my PhD research that I did under supervision of Professor Leen Danens at the Institute for Media Studies in KU Leuven. So thank you very much for having me again here. I'm glad to be back. Although it's only virtual now in these times of COVID. So yeah, the summary of this article. And the article, what it does, it starts off with a story of the brothers Tsarnaev. And as you maybe know, they are being held responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. And their story is relevant because it's often considered that those two brothers have been radicalized exclusively online. And more specifically by a magazine that was distributed and produced by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is called Inspire. And in fact, the bombs that those two brothers used in the marathon bombing, they were built on the basis of an instructions in an article in this Inspire magazine. So here is a screenshot of this article, and it details in how, if you use a pressure, it details how to build a bomb out of a pressure cooker. And so this is an illustrative example because it became, it became really an example for what was called open source jihad, or the idea of bedroom radicals. Something that is the underlying idea here is that having internet connection is sufficient for radicalizing someone. And now anecdotal evidence such as this with the marathon bombing, it's easy to find. And as a result, and because the majority of the current state of knowledge, the current state of the literature, is based on case studies and on the basis of anecdotal evidence or a retrospective case study with terrorists, there is a strong divide in the literature. And that is, there are basically two sides. So one side argues that the question is not whether the internet has an influence on radicalization. We know it has an influence, and it is a big and diverse one. On the other side, there is the other side of the debate argued that there is in fact no yet proven connection between the consumption of online extremist contents and the development of extremist ideology or the engagement in violent extremism or terrorism. And the main reason for this divide is that there is, and it's a critique that has been, that terrorism studies and radicalization studies has recently received, regularly received, I should say, is that there is a lack of empirical data, large-scale empirical data. And so that is the main aim of my study, was to address this lack of data and to conduct a large-scale study with two aims. So the first aim is to explore how multiple types of jihadist materials are independently associated with cognitive radicalization. And the second aim was to test a hypothesized multi-step and multifactorial process of cognitive radicalization, and thereby paying specifically attention to three factors. So they are cyberspace factors, which is information seeking, cognitive psychological factors, which is moral disengagement, and social behavioral factors, which is prior involvement in youth delinquency or in petty crime. And in order to do this, we used a cross-sectional online survey study among about 1,900 Belgian young adults, so school-going youth. We had a relatively well distribution of men and women, an equal distribution between men and women, and the average age of our respondents was 17 years of age. So let's look more into detail what we studied. There are 6 different types of Salafi jihadist materials that we investigated here. And to be more precise, we studied active exposure. So we asked the youngsters, to what extent do you know these things, these materials? And the second question was, to what extent are you actively searching for those materials? And the study that I'm presenting here today is about the second question, is to what extent are you actively consulting those contents? And so the six different types that we looked at was Dabiq, which is the propaganda magazine of Islamic State. Has been a long time considered the flagship propaganda outlet, as it contains really the ideological backbone of the Islamic State. The second material was Inspire magazine. We just saw that also with the Tsarnaev brothers. So it's the Al-Qaeda magazine. Then we asked whether they consulted promotional videos of Islamic State or, for example, Sharia for Belgium. Beheading videos was the fourth type of materials that we were looking at. And the last two materials were Salafi jihadist fora, whether they were online or whether they were on Facebook. So let's quickly run through a brief summary of the main results. So the first thing that I should say is that the results were kind of surprising to us. And I will only highlight a few of the results. And if you want to know more, of course, you can look up the article. It's available online and it's open source, so or open access, so you don't need a subscription. So first thing that was interesting in our findings was that, and you should see the beheading videos here. They were sought for by about 40% of the youngsters. So the question was, again, to what extent are you actively searching out those contents? And 40% of the youngsters said that they were seeking out for beheading videos. The least sought materials were the magazine series. So Dabiq, the Islamic State magazine, and Inspire, the Al-Qaeda magazine. Now, if we look at their independent association with the cognitive radicalization measure, which we have, this is a measure, it's called SIFOR, the Sympathies for Radicalization Scale. And this is a study that we also recently validated with a team from Quebec, from McGill University. And this study will be published soon. It's accepted, and it will be published in Transcultural Psychiatry. And so if we look to what extent searching those materials, to what extent that is actually related to cognitive radicalization, then we see three interesting findings. Let's first look at the second row at the right side. This is the beheading videos. And there you see that the two distributions, where they're seeking out for those materials and not seeking out those materials, follow a reasonably similar distribution, with the majority of the people scoring low on radicalization. If we look at the first row, so these are pane A and pane B, there we see that the blue curves are strongly different, or are significantly different from the red curves or orange curves. I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure what colors these are. But the thing is that the blue tinted curve is different, and you see there is a peak of people scoring higher on radicalization, and this average is higher for those who seek these materials than those who seek not. A second part of the study that we did is a structural equation model. So this is where we test the multi-step theory of puzzle theory of radicalization. And as you can see here, this is the model that we tested. So this is theoretically driven. And we found 4 paths that are significant in this internet and radicalization nexus. So the first path that we found that was statistically significant was the cognitive path. So seeking jihadist information materials, or jihadist materials, is associated, relatively substantial, with the copying of arguments in those materials, and with therefore a higher score on moral disengagement. In a second step, this is then associated with a stronger score or a higher score on cognitive radicalization. A second statistically significant path that we found was through juvenile delinquency. So this corroborates previous studies which are focusing on the crime-terror nexus, arguing that the more crucial risk factor to radicalize or to participate in terrorism is a criminal background. And so this path is also confirmed in our data, that the more people seek, the more they are they were involved in juvenile delinquency, and the more they are radicalized on a cognitive level. The third path is a cognitive behavioral path. So seeking more of those materials is associated with a higher moral disengagement, which is associated with more engagement in youth delinquency, which is in turn associated with a stronger cognitive radicalization. And the last path, but was with the least with the lowest strength, is the direct path. So jihadist information seeking was also directly positively associated with cognitive radicalization, which means the more youth actively sought out for these materials, the more that they were, the higher they scored on this radicalization measure. So if we sum up, there are 3 take-home messages from this study. And the first one is that apparently these jihadist materials, they do what they are designed for. So beheading videos are not necessarily designed to radicalize people, but to attract attention, to get the message out there. And this is exactly what they do. So beheading videos, maybe the most violent and radical form of any of the jihadist materials in this study, they were most sought, and they were by almost 40% of the youngsters they were sought, but they were the least predictive in terms of radicalization. In contrast, the jihadist magazines, which were sought by only a small minority, 10%, 11%, but they were the most strongly associated with radicalization. And again, here, though they are not, those magazines are not made to attract attention, but they are made for a niche audience in order to radicalize them and in order to attract support for the cause. And the second take-home message here is that cognitive radicalization is indeed a phasic trajectory in which information seeking of radical materials, of extremist materials, is also associated with gradually more risk behaviors such as criminality and ultimately in the willingness to participate in political violence. So these were these 4 paths that we just saw. And the last take-home message, and that's a message, and that's an argument that we can elaborate further on in the discussion, is whether it says is that the internet, not the internet as such, or the availability of materials online that radicalizes young adults, but it's mainly people's behavior, first step of looking out for those materials. But most certainly it is moral disengagement and prior involvement in youth delinquency that molds youngsters into radicals. So of course, there's still questions that are unanswered here. And one of them is, what are the risk factors of people seeking out for those materials? How can we understand when people are seeking out for those materials and when they do not? And also, there is, of course, here a focus on Salafi jihadist materials online. And this is only, you could see this is, say that this is maybe just a case study. And with the abundance of extremist right materials that circulate today, including live stream videos of attacks, it could be very interesting to replicate this study with different types of extremist content to see if this similar process can be found, or whether this is a robust finding that goes across all different types of radicalization. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you want to continue the discussion, please contact me or connect with me on Twitter. This is my Twitter handle. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So your presentation raised a few questions, so I'm trying to get to them. First, I have a technical question from one of the members of the audience, and it's about your structural equation model. The person asks, did you account for potential intercorrelations between your explanatory variables, as all paths were significant? Could that be due to high intercorrelation?
Yeah, excellent question. Very nano question on this statistics. And yeah, so what we did before was running just multivariate analysis, so multiple regression analysis, to exclude the possibility of multicollinearity. And yeah, there is of course always that possibility, but they are, if we put them all together in one model, they are all they remain all significantly associated with one another. And also, I forgot to mention this, but this model is controlled for three socio-demographic variables, which are the respondent's sex, the age, and whether they were Muslim, yes or no.
Okay, thanks. In hindsight, now, would you still think that digital media radicalization are still in a symbiotic relationship? Remember the discussion we had about this notion of symbiosis. In hindsight, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I think this is still, this hasn't changed, I think. And this is also, I guess, I'm a little bit the odd one out today, right? So the most of the studies here today were on Islamophobia, and this one is on Salafi jihadist radicalization. But I think what the other presenters also show this inextricably they're inextricably related, and the way terrorism is being done these days is still according to the logic of the media and of social media. And this whole idea that platforms now have live streams, this is now being live streamed. This shapes a different form of terrorism that we see these days, specifically extremist right-wing actors. And I still believe that the media, digital media, mold terrorism today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Abdelwahed has a question. I'll give the floor to you in a minute, Abdelwahed. There's also a question coming from Mehmet Kilic, and he is drawing on the education aspect. So to our Polish team and also our Canadian team, it would be interesting to perhaps talk a bit on the promotion of multicultural education and global education to raise the understanding and the dialogue among the students from diverse backgrounds. So Mehmet is referring to his experience in New York. What do the Canadian speakers have to say about that? And then maybe our Polish colleagues can also react to that role of education. And yeah, colleges and schools are seen as both vectors of radicalization, but also as protective factors. So maybe the Canadians, maybe Vivek and his team wants to react to this.
Well, I'm not really sure. I got the question. I don't see it in the chat, but it's about the role of education. Is that what you're asking?
It came through the Padlet, and also it was a question that came through our Q&A chat box. So what's the role of civil society in cultivating youth with diversity and multicultural understanding?
I mean, it's an obvious answer, right? I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, I think we need to move into action. Rhetoric is one thing.
Yeah.
But we need to move into action. I think part of the problem we're facing is that we tend to view media literacy as demonstrating or at least showing the path towards an enlightened truth. And that's really hardly the case. I think we need to allow for more pluralistic spaces for dialogue. I think it's wrong to shut down those who we disagree with. I think that there are, I think there's something to be said around ensuring that we don't rush to build consensus, especially around issues as sensitive as adherence to religion, political ideals, political values. So it's one thing to say education should play a role, but it's another to actually look at the varieties of ways in which that can happen. And I'm I'm not cynical about this issue at all. I work in this field. I train teachers, and I'm a school teacher by training myself. So it's not a question of being cynical. It's a question of understanding that a whole society approach involves not just looking at education as a hierarchy of knowledge that's transferred from a teacher to a student. Amongst us, I don't know how many of us, in fact, are looking to the global south to understand these issues. How do we look at Paulo Freire's seminal writings and learn to teach with as opposed to teach to? Are we doing that at this webinar, right? What are we doing in terms of ensuring that we understand what's happening sur le terrain, in communities? How do you build resilience from within? And so that's, I think, part of our broader role in understanding how social forms and public forms of pedagogy and not just education can play a role. Again, I think there's multiple ways to look at this, but policymakers have to be able to draw upon the broader qualitative nature of what's being framed as resilience measures within communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think tomorrow's seminar will more be on action and how youth work is taking also advantage of what has been done in academic research, use that evidence in the practice of youth work. So next seminar will probably be more on action rather than on discourse. Abdelwahed, please, if you want to have your question live, please go ahead. Abdelwahed? No? So I had also, maybe he's coming back later, but my question to him and the other people this afternoon was, what he said in the beginning. It is impossible to understand Islamophobia if you don't understand the complexity of Islam. So does that mean then that by definition we need to have teams, interdisciplinary teams to grasp that complexity? It was a question to Abdelwahed because he came up with this interesting thought, but it's actually a question to any of the speakers. Abdelwahed, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was disconnected when you were asking your question, so I didn't hear it.
No problem.
Just
no
briefly.
problem. I thought you wanted to ask a question yourself to one or the other speakers. And my question related to your statement in the beginning of your presentation, which was triggering my question, and it was, you need to understand the complexity of Islam in order to be able to deal with the complexity of Islamophobia. So I was then relating that statement to the interdisciplinarity that is needed of the teams in which we work in order to grasp to the full that complexity.
Yes. So there are a couple of things here, so I'll try to be brief. First of all, just to jump on what you were talking with Vivek, is that I think despite our good intentions as scholars, as researchers, and despite the efforts we make, maybe we don't do enough in terms of going out into the street and share our knowledge with people out of the academia milieu. So we do some, but I guess we need to do more, and in some new, more original ways to do it. Maybe there is something to share our knowledge. In terms of better understanding the complexity of Islam in order to better understand Islamophobia, since Islamophobia is targeting Islamicness, so are we sure we know we understand the target? I mean, are we sure we understand who and what is targeted? So how can we talk about Islamophobia if we don't understand what Islamophobia is targeting? So that what makes it a complex issue. So maybe as scholars also, so that's kind of self-criticism. If we have, one of the reasons why we have so much trouble understanding Islamophobia is either we address it in a too simplistic way, or we don't understand Islam enough. So maybe it's just a question. So that we may want to explore. I don't know if it's I answered your question.
Sure.
So thank. So I have two questions. I had to talk that much, but I try to be as brief as possible. So one is for my colleague Thomas Friesen, and the other for my colleagues from Poland. Tom, it's a fascinating study, and I see the link with the two projects, your and ours with Lina and me and Vivek. And when you say that the more the youth seek jihadist information, the more there are juvenile delinquency and cognitive radicalization. Are you talking about juvenile delinquency and cognitive radicalization in general, or linked to Islam? So you know what I mean? I mean, in other words, is this jihadist information, est-ce que ça abreuve aussi la radicalisation qui n'est pas revendiquée au nom de l'islam, mais aussi la radicalisation extrême droitiste? Est-ce que la radicalisation au nom de l'islam a une influence sur la radicalisation violente? Non, qui n'a rien à voir avec l'islam. And my question for my colleagues from Poland, thank you so much for your presentation, is maybe I have missed the explanation, but how would you explain this new thing to me, that it's youth are becoming more radical than the elder in Poland, which seems to kind of transformation, radical transformation in Poland. So thank you.
Tom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ok. Oui, merci beaucoup pour vos questions. Je vais essayer de répondre en anglais. Ça, je me sens plus confortable en anglais, donc voilà. So, the measure for cognitive radicalization that we used is originally developed in by psychiatrists in a Muslim sample, in a Muslim migrant sample. But what we did with the team of Cécile Rousseau, we tested this measurement on sensitivities for people with different background, and whether it was maybe discriminating towards, for example, youth with a Muslim background or not. And what we came up with was a final version of this measurement, in which specific questions that could be associated with only terrorism as we know it in the context of Salafi jihadism, for example, the use of suicide belts. This is remarkably unseen in extremist right circles, for example. These questions are in the original measure for cognitive radicalization, in the original Sci4, but after our validation study, those didn't make it. And that had nothing to do with whether they were discriminating or were difficult, but they were just not relevant, and therefore they were not contributing to a measurement of cognitive radicalization. So we ended up with 4 questions, and those 4 questions are relatively generic, I would say. So it would be: are you willing to use violence to protect your group or community in society? Would you be willing to use weapons in order to defend your community or your ideas? And so the final version is relatively generic in order to measure willingness to use violence in the context of political protest. And so, interestingly, we asked respondents whether they were Muslims themselves, and so this was a control variable. And interestingly, the Muslim youth scored low on the radicalization scale. They scored lower than the non-Muslims on the criminality scale. And so there is here, and in the final model, the religion was not a significant predictor. So also in the discussion of the paper, we argue to what extent is religion indeed relevant in this multiphasic project, or to what extent are there other risk factors more important? One of those being moral disengagement, for example. And I think this is also what we have been discussing a few times today, is a very important thing in moral disengagement is dehumanization of the other. And so I think here this is also the key in countering radicalization, countering extremism, and that ties probably into the debate on how to, what's the role of education, and that is empathy. I think empathy is something that we can learn and that can be taught, and it's the antidote to dehumanization, to specific moral disengagement that I think is important to teach. Not necessarily taking down specific discourses on the internet. So yeah, that is my answer.
Okay, thank you. Katarzyna, maybe.
Okay, well, I will try, because, we have only recently started to see a problem. And I mean, also the other side of the world, the Western Europe, started to see that we, in a way, are Islamophobic, even though there are not many Muslims. So it's like, a couple of years, it's still in the very beginning. But I would say that one of the factors is that our youth is apolitical, but at the same time, if it is political, then it's extremely political, including extremely right political. Then the second point is that it's Islam, it's the refugee crisis, it's the 9/11 that is interesting. We borrow that discourse from the Western Europe, from the US, about the Middle East, about the challenges related to the presence of Muslims. And it seems, or it seemed, that in this way, we wanted to be included into this European discourse. It is strange, but we wanted to have our part in there. We have no our own Muslims. Our Muslims are, by the way, completely well assimilated, integrated. There is nothing, but we wanted to be included. At the same time, you have to bear in mind that many Poles are actually competing on the labor market in the UK, in Germany, with also people of Muslim background. So this is, it is interconnected. And then we are allowed, since 2015, the political shift that we are now experiencing, and you know that Poland and Hungary, we are in a way called together as the worst possible countries in the European Union, unfortunately. We are allowed, and it went public, So if our politicians use the discourse, and it's completely fine to do it, then people feel in a way attracted. And we have hardly any Muslim community that could oppose it in a way, or lobby against this kind of discourse. So if you put everything together, plus the fact that, as you know, we are having now strong demonstrations for judiciary independence, for women's rights, and so on, you have a chaotic country. And I would say that this Islamophobic narrative and young people radicalized is just one part of a bigger problem. We are still, you know, trying to figure our way.
Thank you, Katarzyna. I think we have to close this webinar because time is up, but although we have still some questions queuing up, but we'll make sure that these get answered after the webinar. I think it became clear that local dynamics and national histories and different social policies all influence differently this radicalization process. So it's very interesting to see that trajectory in different countries. Tomorrow, I would like to invite all of you to again meet at 3 o'clock. The word was said, we need action rather than discourse, so we'll get some action, we'll get some experience, some interesting look at the youth work in Belgium. And for now, I would like to thank all the speakers for their inspiring presentations. Please keep following the work of this European project, this extremely united project on the website. The webinar will be edited and will be found there too in the coming days. And I hope you can find the time to take a look. Maybe if tomorrow you can't make it, take a look at it in the coming days, because we will be moving to evidence-inspired practice in youth work. So thanks a lot. Thank you for your interest and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for organizing.